What is trauma? In a way, it kind of depends on the kind of trauma that you're talking about. My name is Pablo Das. I am trained as a Buddhist teacher and as a holistic wellness coach. I work with people around the resolution of trauma and recovery from addiction. My website is causesofwellbeing.com. And today I want to take up the question, what is trauma? Here is my current best definition. Trauma occurs when an experience has a long-term impact on the sensitivity of the stress response system. So there's a lot to unpack there. I'll say it again. Trauma occurs when an experience has a long-term impact on the sensitivity of the human stress response system. So I'm going to spend the rest of the video breaking this down. So first thing I want to tackle is the idea of experience and what kinds of experiences are potentially traumatizing. It is important to acknowledge that traumas don't simply occur in the context of single events, but rather also in relationship to ongoing sets of conditions. And the best way for me to unpack that is to kind of go into the three types of trauma that I recognize. So the first type of trauma that I recognize is what we call shock traumas. These are in fact the single events that overwhelm our capacity for self-protective response, leave us feeling victimized, unable to respond in a self-protective way. These experiences can leave us managing symptoms that we would typically recognize as associated with trauma. I mean, the kind of events I'm talking about are the car accidents, the assaults, those kind of single events that have a major impact on our system and our sense of well-being. The kinds of experiences that are traditionally associated, or rather symptoms that are traditionally associated with trauma, are things like anxiety, panic attacks, depression, sense of not quite being embodied or dissociation, avoidance patterns. This is a huge part of traumatic experiences. In the long term, people will avoid situations that remind them of the experience. And many people who have been impacted by single event shock traumas will have intrusive imagery that they have to deal with. So this is one kind of trauma. The second kind of trauma that I recognize is really related to what happens to us when our brains and our nervous systems are developing early in life. Now, as children, we need our primary caregivers to be attuned and responsive to our needs. We need our environments to be safe. We need them to be predictable. In a way, we learn to regulate our emotions in relationship to our primary caregivers and the kind of adults around us who hopefully themselves feel safe and well-resourced and secure. Now, when these things don't happen, we're impacted by that. And we carry that conditioning into adulthood in any number of ways. So this is the kind of trauma that we would talk about as developmental trauma. Now, the third kind of trauma, and the kind which I think gets a lot less airtime, although recently there's some more awareness of this, is the trauma that's associated with being part of or having membership in historically marginalized communities. Now, as a gay man myself, I have thought a lot about what would justify the kind of separate category and what distinguishes the trauma that's associated with marginalization from the other two that I just talked about. And we have to acknowledge, of course, there is a kind of crossover and similar experiences. But here's a couple things that I think about a lot. One is that unlike other kinds of trauma, the conditions for other kinds of trauma to arise, which seem to have a kind of a beginning, middle, and end. The trauma that's associated with marginalization doesn't seem to have that same kind of arc, but rather we are often trying to cope in a set of conditions that has no beginning, middle, and end. It's just kind of an ongoing set of conditions. We know that there are ways in which the traumas of members of traditionally marginalized communities are transmitted epigenetically, intergenerationally between members of those communities. The trauma of marginalization also, and this is really kind of an insidious piece of it, it targets something very specific and immutable about who you are. That's really difficult. And also, I try to stay away from the kind of current language of in the culture, but there's a definite truth to the concept of microaggressions. And what this really means is that there are ways, as you're growing up as part of a marginalized community, that there are these kind of persistent, constant reminders from the environment, from other people, from your schools and your jobs and the institutions that are there in society, which are constantly reminding you that you aren't valued, that you're not understood, that you're not really part of the thing. There's a way in which you are repeatedly sort of cast as other. And this is really damaging to human beings. Human beings do not do well when they feel as though they're kind of put out of the tribe. That is a very threatening experience. And of course, there are legitimate, not that those aren't legitimate, but there are more, what I meant to say is explicit threats to people in marginalized communities that are the kinds of single event traumas. There are things that go on developmentally early in life as you start to figure out, especially for gay and trans people. Anyway, you get it. So these are the three types of experiences. So that kind of covers the first part of the definition. So let me come back to the definition. Trauma occurs when an experience has a long-term impact on the sensitivity of the stress response system. So I want to talk about this concept of long-term impact. Clinically speaking, I'm not a clinician, but the generally accepted definition of PTSD has this piece about the time frame in which symptoms persist. And I think in clinical settings, people look for symptoms to persist over a month. But the fact is that trauma, the symptoms associated with trauma can persist for many years, decades even, if they are not confronted and worked with and healed. So that's an important piece to acknowledge, that there is a difference between what we might think of as difficult human experiences and experiences that are actually qualify as trauma. Trauma is about overwhelm. Trauma is about persistent symptoms over the long term that are very difficult for people to cope with. There are lots of difficult human experiences that are not traumas. And I don't want to be too dismissive, but I think just because of a little bit of a rising consciousness about trauma in the culture, there is this sort of trend now where people are claiming things to be trauma, which really, really aren't. There are lots of very difficult experiences in human life that are not traumas. And so it is important to be able to distinguish between those kinds of things. I was just talking to a clinician over the weekend, and we were talking about something that was happening in an acquaintance of ours, and the clinician just said, give them a minute before we jump to trauma. We want to make sure that the appropriate amount of time elapses. And this is an important piece. So trauma occurs when an experience has a long-term impact on the sensitivity of the human response, stress response system. So what does it mean to be sensitized to, what does the sensitization of the stress response system look like? Well, it looks like a lot of things. But maybe one of the most important things that happens in people who have been impacted by traumatic events is that there is a hypersensitivity, and we become highly attuned to threat. It's what we call hypervigilance. This is particularly important when we talk about people who truly could not find a self-protective response when something happened. And it really does, in a way, come down to that. Like, can we respond in, I like to say, empowered ways to those things which are threats to our sense of self? And by the way, trauma isn't just about physical threat. Trauma is about psychological and emotional threat. The threat of sense of self, not just physical self, but psychological self, to identity, to the development of ego, to the place in the social order. When these things are not going well for us, when we have these kind of experiences, we become hyper vigilant and hypersensitized to what's happening in the environment around us. So people who have a trauma history very often don't miss anything. We are hyper focused on the people around us, to their body language, to the words they're using, to the way that they're standing in the room. So that's the kind of sensitivity that we're talking about. And that, there's also, of course, the sensitivity of just having a quick fear responses, a potential to be easily overwhelmed in certain situations, to become, flooded with energy in a way that is not so, not always so proportional to whatever's happening. It's very clear that, there's something else going on. Some of your history is also present in this experience. So, and then finally, the stress response system. When we talk about the stress response system, we're talking about certain parts of the brain working together with the autonomic nervous system. This is the fight, flight, freeze, and social engagement system that is there to help us cope with, to navigate threat. So when we talk about the sensitization of the stress response system, we're talking about being highly sensitive and quick fight responses, quick flight responses, where people will dissociate and go into freeze responses very easily, where some of our capacity to ask for help or to seek allyship become compromised or underdeveloped. So trauma is actually a very nuanced, a very personal, and a very, how would I say this? It's just a very nuanced and complex matter. I guess the last thing that I want to say is this. There's almost no such thing as a traumatic event. Now, there are lots of things that are probably fairly predictably will lead to traumatic symptoms or symptoms that we would associate with trauma. But trauma is not about the event. Trauma is about the interface between an event or a set of conditions, as I've described them, and an individual and their nervous system. And so what becomes really interesting is when we think about certain experiences in the world where two or more people can have the same experience, and only one of them will walk away managing symptoms, seeming to have been impacted in a certain kind of way where they're left managing difficult emotional or psychological states. And that's where we get into the reason why it's important to distinguish between the different kinds of trauma. Because in my view, shock traumas, it's single events that are sometimes overwhelming to some, but not overwhelming to others, has everything to do with the other two types of trauma. It's that people come in and arrive at experiences, in adult life with their histories. As the famous book on trauma by Bessel van der Kolk says, the body keeps the score, right? We are moving through spaces with our history, with the sensitization of our system, and a sense of resilience or capacity in any given moment. And then we encounter these things that are potentially overwhelming, potentially threatening, and our history matters. So people who have developmental trauma, people who have are managing the trauma of, membership in marginalized communities, are probably more vulnerable than the average person when it comes to single event experiences in adulthood. And that's why two people can be in a car accident and only one of them can walk away managing symptoms. So trauma is not actually about the event. It is about the interface between an event or a set of conditions and a person bringing their nervous system, bringing the conditioning of their brain, bringing their history into that situation. So in a separate video, I will get into what healing looks like in terms of trauma. Each of these different kinds of trauma are very different in terms of what healing looks like. And I imagine the video is getting long, so I'm going to stop there. If you're interested in one-on-one support, you can go to my website, causesofwellbeing.com. You can go to the coaching tab. There's any number of ways to send a contact message, and I can reach out to you and we can figure out if I'm the right person to support you. If you would, especially at these early stages of these videos and the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It would mean a lot to me. It would send me a message that I'm doing something worth all of the effort. If you could see what's going on here in the background, it's a lot. And in the comments, let me know what you'd like to see videos about in the future. I will take these suggestions to heart. So I look forward to your feedback. causesofwellbeing.com. I'll see you next week with another video and a podcast. See you around. Cheers.